thank you very much for coming. Thank you for being here. I hope people online can hear me. There's no way to know if they do, but they should, because technology works. I have unmuted myself, so that should be enough. So today's roundtable is a follow-up on the lecture that Professor Larry Gostin gave yesterday, and I think many of you would have been there, either in person or online. So in the interest of time, I'm going to keep the introduction short. Also because Eric already gave an excellent introduction to Professor Gostin yesterday. Let me just quickly mention that Professor Larry Gostin is a university professor of global health law at Georgetown University. He's the director of the WHO Collaborating Center on Public Health Law and Human Rights, and he's many other things that we don't have really the time to list. And you might know, or you probably know, he's been very active throughout the years in policy through various epidemics, from HIV to Ebola, Zika, and COVID, of course. So how this is going to work? So Professor Gostin is going to give a short recap, very brief, like 5 minutes, of his lecture, of the main points of his lecture yesterday, because most of you would have been there anyway. And then we have 4 speakers that are going to speak for 5 or 10 minutes about their views on the issue. And let me introduce these speakers. So we have Professor Mark Harrison, who is a professor of the history of medicine here in Oxford and is co-director of the Wellcome Center for Medical Humanities. Professor Mike Parker, who is professor of bioethics at the Health Centers and also co-director of the Wellcome Center for Ethics and Humanities. We have Professor Imogen Gould, who is professor of medical law at the University here in Oxford, and Professor Peter Horby, who is the professor of emerging infections and disease and global health, and is the director of the Oxford Pandemic Sciences Institute. So each of them is going to speak for 5-10 minutes, and then we can open the floor for discussion. But I would first invite Professor Gostin here to give a brief recap of the main points. I would ask you to go no longer than 10 minutes, if you can.
You said 5.
Even better. I want to be generous, but the shorter the better, because ideally you want to finish by 12:15, but ideally a bit earlier.
Yeah, 12:15 would be great.
Let's aim for earlier, but let's see how. Yeah, okay. So if you want to come here, because people will be able to see you speaking from this camera. Okay. Thank you very much. Thanks.
Well, thanks everyone. Seems very artificial. We should just all be at the table. So, it's impossible to really recap the whole talk. I think I went through, I can't even remember what I did. I think I went through kind of a brief history of recent pandemics, everything from H1N1 through to the 2 Ebola epidemics in West Africa and then DRC, and then kind of finished with the coronaviruses, SARS, MERS, and SARS-CoV-2, and then polio and monkeypox. Just kind of looking at recent outbreaks and then explaining that it feels like we do have a lot of increased episodes of these kinds of events, just like we feel like we've got increased episodes of climate-related events in terms of droughts and floods and extreme heat and extreme cold. We're seeing the same thing with epidemics. Our intuitions are right, both in climate change and in viral threats, in the sense that they've expanded about 4-fold over recent years. And then I went on to explain why that's true, looking at zoonoses as well as and what brings them in contact with humans in terms of deforestation, land management, wet markets, live animal trade, things like that, along with increased urbanization and mass travel, and a whole range of other reasons why it's no coincidence that when you have a highly transmissible and pathogenic virus that can mutate quite a lot, like SARS-2 has done. We are very vulnerable to these kinds of episodes. And then I looked at some lessons learned in terms of health systems, global solidarity, equity, health communication. We spent a lot of time talking about trust, and then the collateral impacts on the Sustainable Development Goals and childhood vaccinations and the like. And then I finished talking about the three major initiatives at globally, with both at the UN level, with in New York, where the General Assembly held a session on global security, as well as at WHO on WHO sustainable financing, international health regulations reform, and the pandemic treaty. And then I talked pretty much about the four pillars of this opportunity we have, which is prevention, preparedness, response, and recovery. Talked about how prevention is the most important, but it's among the least likely to get done. Recovery is very important. That's not likely to get done. But that leaves preparedness and response, which can be helpful. And I think with a concentration on equity, we spent quite a lot of time talking about, what went wrong in terms of equity and what are possible innovative models for ensuring a more equitable distribution of medical resources. That's 5 minutes.
Excellent. That's even less than 5 minutes, I think.
Oh, that's
Perfect. So my suggestion is that we go by alphabetic order. So that's the easiest way to go. And so I would ask Professor Imogen Gould if you want to give us your floor. Thank you very much.
Do you want me to come up?
Yeah, that'd be ideal. Thank you. But it's for people that are online. Thank you.
Okay, so what I thought I would do is talk a bit about what I felt law could do in this context. And obviously, for most of you, you're thinking about healthcare systems, governance systems, that sort of thing, and the ethics of these things. And as a lawyer, I thought, what can I bring to the table? And I was thinking about some of the things that came up in Harry's talk, and also my conversations last night with Dom and Roger and other people. And what can law do in the context of these? And one is the inequalities issue, and one is the trust issue. And law operates, of course, at lots of different levels: international laws, human rights law, local laws, national laws, local government laws, all of these sort of levels. And I thought one of the things law can do that we should be thinking about is it should help this preparation dimension of what Larry is saying. What can law do for that? Law can help support measures both international levels and local levels to make us more robust for next time by mandating certain things and also governmentally supporting measures that are going to do that. But I think the other thing is this getting ahead of the problem and thinking through some of the challenges that we saw in the last pandemic. So things like travel controls, border controls, and those sorts of rules. Obviously, they've got a very legal dimension to them, and that's one thing that an effective strategy would do prior to begin to work out those rules and negotiate them better. And another problem that obviously arose was hoarding. So hoarding of vaccines, hoarding of supplies, and so on. How can law operate there? And that strikes me as an international law question and a cooperative question as well. But I think the really interesting thing is how the national laws have an impact. What we saw in this country, lots of countries, of course, was lockdowns, really stringent controls on people's rights, mask wearing, vaccination policies. And I thought, well, what should we do next time? We reflect on what our laws did, in that we had these very rapidly put in place, really stringent controls. And one of the things I think that we need to reflect on how we do this next time is how they were rolled out. So Adam Wagner's a human rights barrister, and he makes the point, well, actually, a lot of them were rolled out so rapidly that they didn't really have a mandate. And that, in fact, not only was it problematic in the way some of them were done, but it was problematic in the way that they were received, because it was often opaque, and they were sort of changing and moderating. So one thing is we can learn from that process and have a better process and a more worked out way of doing that. Another thing I think is really interesting where law has a role is vaccination policy. This is what I'm talking to Alberto a bit about and others about. And this is the sort of space in which law can operate really efficiently and effectively. In one sense, it can make it mandatory. But of course, that's probably the wrong response, absolutely. Even though you could use all of those punitive tools, all its coercive tools, everything I hear from people about vaccinations, that just doesn't work very well. If you come in with a big cosh, essentially, and the law says we must do this, and then you deploy your policing systems to make that happen, you deploy fines, as we saw for people breaking lockdowns and so on. It doesn't necessarily work very well, even though it might seem appealing. And it might seem like a utilitarian way to approach it, to rapidly get a response and get behaviours under control, in a sense. And so that was where I was thinking about some of the things people were talking about in terms of trust. And actually, one thing I think we should reflect on is resisting the temptation to use law in that really stringent, punitive way, and that really controlling way, and instead use it as being facilitative. We shouldn't actually look to the law to drive behaviour and force behaviour, but actually do all that groundwork about trust in law. So I had a really interesting conversation with Mark Harrison about how police were sort of mediating the impact of some of the quite stringent laws and that he's observed in communities. And that's a really fascinating thing. If you put in place a hugely stringent law, it doesn't actually call with how people are prepared to behave. You end up creating a law that butts against behaviour all the time. And the only way you can work through that is either to be highly punitive, fine people all the time, police them really heavily, or you just give up. And that, I think, always tells you that your law is probably not working very well, or you haven't done the underpinning work that you needed to have that law received well. So that would be one reflection. And the other, I think, is the obvious one for this country, that there is a huge erosion of trust in government. That when we set up rules, we have to have a government that actually abides by those rules as well. Because, of course, we saw that happen, that we had stringent rules that might have been rational and good rules. But when we allow people to not follow those rules, we end up in a situation where the law comes into disrepute, essentially. So I think there's sort of two takeaways from that. One is we have to set up legal systems and use the law in a way that people will actually follow, in a way that we can manage. But when we do that, we need to think about the implications of those laws for people as well. So one of the reasons that people were breaking some laws, like lockdown laws and gathering laws, was precisely because they were so harming, so stringent for them, so problematic, and they had very big incentives to break. And the goals that those laws are trying to achieve might be quite distant for them. So that strikes me as where we do the work to build trust and communication so that people don't have to be policed into following laws, but rather they're inclined to follow them precisely because they can see the impact of those laws and the benefits that they get, but also to see that their rule following will be also, other people will follow the rules as well. So it seems like it's worth following the rules because other people will too. And the final thing I wanted to say is drawing another point that Adam's made, where he said that one of the things we can really see in the post-pandemic period is how much of our freedoms were constrained. There were really stringent freedom of movement controls, freedom of association controls came in with the pandemic, and rightly so. But he makes the point, and I think he's right, that we then, when we reflect on this, think, when do we get those freedoms back and how does that process happen? One part of it. But also, what are the implications for the way governance now happens in the light of that? So we've seen a government that has now had an opportunity to put in place really stringent controls really rapidly. And whether or not that has knock-on effects about how we think about the role of that government, how that government is behaving, and when we begin to relax them, how we do that is a process, I think, that when we're beginning to make laws for the next pandemic, we need to be thinking about how and when and why will they be rolled back, and what will that look like, and what are the lasting implications for the fact that we went through this phase of deeply controlled behaviour, that we let go of that. Because I think that is one thing we can see now is a government that's has become quite used to actually controlling behaviours and being enabled to do so. We need to think about how we step back from that and whether we do and how we do that. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. It's very interesting. So let's keep some questions for later. So I would invite Professor Mark Harrison so we can get the history perspective on the issue. Thank you, Mark.
Well, I'm going to change what I was going to talk about in the last what Imogen just
said. I'm so sorry.
No, actually, I think in some ways, I think I'll find a way of joining it. I mean, one of the things I wanted to do really in this few minutes is to sort of bring together my observations as a historian and also the kind of work I was doing during the pandemic as a government advisor, really, which was kind of looking very, very closely about how people behaved during the pandemic and their reaction to the COVID regulations in the UK. But I was also looking at the international dimension too, and I'll try and bring both of those together. One of the first things I would say, really, which is an observation based on both historical analysis and also what I saw during the pandemic, really, is that people's reactions to regulations, their desire to, or ability to adhere to them really depended on essentially on three main things. And one was the sense of equity. That's sort of been mentioned in several respects. I think it's particularly a sense that everyone was kind of should obey the laws, or and of course when some prominent figures were seen not to obey them, that did obviously create a crisis of confidence and trust. But I don't think it was disastrous. I think if people can still see public health regulations as benefiting them in some way, despite the behaviour of others, they do tend to adhere to them. The real problems arise really with two other things. And one is, I think probably this is one of the most important things, is proportionality, sense of proportionality, whether or not the regulations are proportional to the perceived threat. And I think one of the real difficulties that most governments faced in relation to COVID was that it was such a protean disease. It was constantly changing. Of course, things, the interventions the governments around the world themselves made, for instance, in relation to vaccination, of course, changed the danger that people associated with the disease. And so the fear factor, if you like, kind of diminished considerably through the pandemic, and therefore people were, on the whole, say, less likely to adhere, particularly when it really affected their lives and livelihood. I think Imogen was mentioning what you often saw, I think, was that even though maybe these regulations were supposed to apply to everyone and that they were conceived as being equitable, in reality, the impact that it had on people's lives was not equitable. And usually the poorest sections of society suffered most from the regulations as well as actually from the disease. And I think that the sense that people were being harmed by the regulations, and the regulations were themselves increasingly disproportionate, was in the end one of the reasons why there was so much tension in a number of countries relating to COVID regulations, why people very often just simply either ceased to obey them, adhere to them, or actually found ways to kind of work around the rules in a sort of more or less legal way. And the other issue, I think, is consistency. This is something that Larry brought up in his lecture. I think one of the really important things here is the ability, and he rightly focused on this, the ability to communicate uncertainty. And I think this relates both to vaccination and also to many other aspects of public health regulation. I think that the failure to do that well really, and also the kind of the difficulties of dealing with a disease like COVID, which was obviously a new disease for most people, one seemed to change a lot, was that constantly what people were being told about how best to prevent the disease or reduce risk, and also about the nature of the vaccines and what they could and could not do, was continually changing. That really undermined public confidence. So far better, perhaps, to really be honest, as Larry was saying, about what you know and what you don't know. I think this is important. How far this differed between different countries, how far it's possible to learn lessons, I'm not sure. I was at a meeting in the British Embassy in Paris back in, I think, in March, in which this was being discussed. The French thought that in relation to vaccines, the French thought that they did it much better than we did. They were able to communicate uncertainty at the beginning. I'm not in a position to evaluate that, but there are perhaps some quite useful lessons there in terms of national experience. Maybe some countries did that better than others. But I'd just like to kind of end really with what is essentially a kind of historical observation. It's almost a kind of truism in the historiography of epidemic diseases that epidemics draw out tensions which are latent within society, or perhaps magnify those which are already visible. And that's certainly true of this pandemic within different national contexts. The tensions were obviously different, although there were some quite interesting features they had in common. I think one of the things that we really need to think about is the extent to which a lot of the anxieties that people express in relation to public health regulations are not simply national problems, so when we're talking about trust, we also need to bear in mind not what individual national governments can do better, but also about also bear in mind people's concerns about global governance. There's clearly a great deal of concern about WHO, for instance. And I think to go back to the point that Larry was making about the pandemic treaty, and particularly in relation to the possibility of concluding an agreement in relation to pandemic response. I think one of the key things really that needs to be stressed there is that there's going to be a degree of flexibility to deal with individual circumstances which may differ considerably in states. I think that's in different nation states. I think that's important in practical terms, but I think it's also vitally important in terms of maintaining public confidence. Because what we don't really want to end up with is people getting a sense of what here's it's a kind of globalist power grab. You can see it all over a lot of the sites which are very opposed to vaccination, public health regulation institutions of all kinds. This sense of a loss of control, and I think it's really vital, as Imogen was saying, to make sure that people still feel, in some sense, that they're kind of in control of their destiny, and that any powers which are actually imposed during an pandemic will be relinquished when that ends. And that's really key points I wanted to make.
Thank you very much. So it's very interesting to me that some of the themes that were at the center of the lecture yesterday come up so frequently also today. So, and one is obviously trust, which seems to me to be the key word of all this meeting. And the other thing is proportionality. And it seems to me the relationship between trust and law enforcement in one way, but also trust and science. So it seems to me that these are the key concepts that is worth thinking about, and maybe good to think about the relationship between these themes during the Q&A. But it's interesting, they are the ones that come up all the time during the discussion. Having said so, it's a pleasure to have Professor Peter Horby, who is the director of the Pandemic Science Institute, and it's going to give us a perspective of science, I suppose. Great. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks very much. Great to be here, and sorry I couldn't make your talk last night. But you probably don't remember, but the last time we met was about 20 years ago, the SARS-1.
Right. You were 12 then?
Aged well. Yeah, because I was in Vietnam, SARS-1.
Yeah, I remember.
And
now we've got SARS-2.
And now we've got SARS-2. The question is, have we made much progress? I think characterising the progress as success and failures, I think I was disappointed with the Lancet Commission, which just gave a list of failures, which I'm not sure was that helpful, because there are areas where we have made good progress and areas that we haven't. Actually, need to think about those. And for me, being quite a practical person, it's about what are the most practical things that we can do. I'm disappointed. Well, I'm disappointed. I'm underwhelmed by some of the narrative and the sort of pontificating that's happened. I'm underwhelmed because there's a lot of words and no action. We've got 100-day mission from the G7, etc. No action to actually make it happen. No money from governments at the moment to actually make that happen. But am I disappointed? No, because I've seen it before. So in SARS-1, saw it in bird flu, saw it in pandemic influenza. A lot of political capital trying to be gained by talking about what we'll do to change things, but then not going beyond the rhetoric. And what we're seeing is the same knee-jerk sort of spinal cord reflexes as opposed to sort of cynical thinking. Look at monkeypox. It's been getting out of control in Nigeria for several years, and if you look at the epidemiology, it's mostly men, and it's mostly men in cities. This is not a zoonotic disease. It's being presented as a zoonotic disease. No action was taken. There's a drug that's stockpiled in the US for smallpox. No action was taken to test it in Africa. You look at polio. We know you get vaccine to polio. This could have been anticipated. No action taken. Ebola, Sudan. We know about that virus. We know that the monoclonals don't work for it. We know the vaccines don't work for it. On a call last night, WHO, no vaccines, no drugs for at least 2 or 3 months. You know, there is stuff we know about, stuff we can do, and we're not doing this. Where I'm focusing now is the tractable solutions, which is, you know, we can do stuff at grassroots level. We can improve clinical surveillance. We can improve clinical management. I think we should be focusing much more on containment. I'm with you, Larry, that I think preventing, you know, zoonotic transmissions and outbreaks is extremely challenging. There's hundreds of thousands of viruses we don't know much about them. If you look at flu, which you know about for years, we still can't predict from the genome which flu viruses are going to transmit well and which ones are going to be serious. It's a huge challenge. So I think the sweet spot is, you know, early detection, potential containment. Contained SARS-1, we potentially could have contained SARS-2 with the right actions at the right times early on. Slightly early detection, even just a few weeks, and more aggressive case finding. Perhaps if we had some vaccines available, even if they weren't fully cross-protected, we could have contained it and saved the world a huge headache. There are serious issues there, though, about how you do containment without being accused of overreacting. So if you prevented it, then no one will ever know. I think that's a lot of serious problems as to how you've got to design containment, but then how you would actually implement it in a acceptable way. I don't know. So, you know, I think we need to strengthen health systems. I think we need to increase our abilities to use routine capabilities for exceptional circumstances. I think we were talking earlier, I think it was Mark talking Imogen about, you know, distant benefits and proximal benefits. And I think if we can work on, you know, clinical care, diagnostics, research and development, and patient engagement, public engagement in research and science that has a proximal benefit today, then we'll be having the proximal benefit, you know, short term, and then it'll have benefits in the long term when it comes to serious outbreaks. I think trust and confidence is essential because we can have the best vaccines, the best drugs, and the best public health interventions, but if people don't follow them, they don't trust them, then I think they're not likely to succeed. And we're seeing that again with Ebola, you know, in Uganda, where people are not going to the healthcare centres, and there'll be real challenges in getting people vaccinated because there's still that lack of trust. Again, which we knew about in 2014, still not much further on, 10 years later. Global governance, I'll just sort of finish on that, you know, treaties and resolutions and things. I think I'm a skeptic when it comes to the value of them. I was involved in some early work on the IHR revisions when we saw the failure of the IHR this time around. And I've seen, you know, quite a lot of WHO resolutions that have not really translated into action. So I think, whilst I think those things are important, we have to sort of make sure we really leverage them to get action at a more sort of bottom-up level, so we really improve infrastructure so we can work to make sure there's that response, a bottom-up response. And we're not relying on politicians who, you know, are an unreliable group, I would say. And when under stress, they often, you know, revert to their primary sort of objective, which is sort of national protectionism. And I think however strong the treaties are, however strong the resolutions are, essentially, in a crisis, they will default to national protectionism. We have to sort of assume that be ready to act at a different, you know, sub-political level to make things better.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I was thinking this is another theme that came up yesterday, so the idea of not having learned lessons. It seems to me something close to Professor Gostin was focusing a lot on yesterday. And the common theme here seems to be that we do have the science and the knowledge, but throughout different pandemics, we don't really seem to be learning. And this is something I'd be interested to hear what other people have to say about it, because I'm not sure you agree on what lessons are left to be learned, but you agree that there are some lessons to be learned that keep not learning. So again, let's keep this for discussion. And I would invite Professor Mike Parker, Professor of Bioethics here at the Eden Center. Thank you very much, Mike.
Thanks. Yeah, well, one of the great things about going, usually sometimes there's a problem going last, and sometimes it's good. Lots of people have said things I would have wanted to say, but that's good because I can keep my comment short. But I do have three things I'd like to add as possible themes for the discussion. Before I do that, I want to thank you, Larry, on behalf of, well, all of us really, but particularly the Centre and the Pandemic Science Institute for the talk, and also for giving us this time today. It's great that you were able to come up here to see where we work. So, yeah, and this is a campus where a lot of research on infectious diseases happens. So it's a good place to see. Okay, yeah, just so what I want to do is introduce three themes which kind of touch on some of the things that you've said yesterday, some things that others have said, but also hopefully anew in a way. So these are two things I won't say much about them, just introduce them. So one is going to be to do with the ethics of research during and the role of research during pandemics. Second will be to do with the ethics of preparedness and prevention. And the third will be just to sort of say a little bit about expanding the discussion on trust. So that's essentially one thing. So the first thing is, I think the question of the whole range of research ethics questions about the way in which one might go about doing, should go about doing research during a pandemic, what kinds of research are acceptable and so on. That's not what I wanted to refer to here. I wanted to refer to the fact that just important to note just how few of the interventions that were undertaken were either evidence-based in the first place, but secondly, how few of them had attempts built into them to gather evidence for future generations. So I think there's a kind of analogy here with the way we think about climate change. I think there's an obligation to learn during these experiences for it's tempting to say future generations, but also the next pandemic may not be that far off. So, people in the future anyway. So what are the nature of the kind of obligations? I think that we have to those people and perhaps even to ourselves to learn during, and it strikes me that those are very important consideration. Now I would, assuming that, we're talking about risk, research that's not necessarily risky, obviously there might be questions there, but assuming that we're talking about things like data collection and analysis and so on, that sort of thing, access to personal data, it strikes me that there's a very strong obligation on us as individuals to contribute to and much as we would say, let's not use kind of plastic water bottles, as it were, similarly, it's a fairly low burden on us as individuals, I think, to allow ourselves and our data to contribute to learning for future pandemics. That was really never discussed. And it's striking in the UK at least how few interventions had attempts to build evidence built into them. A good example of it, counterexample is the recovery trial that Peter led. But in the UK, for example, I was involved in setting up a trial which was about opening up sports events of various kinds, so Wimbledon, Grand Prix, football, and so on. And it was strange how hard it was to get that to happen, how hard it was to get institutions that were running those events, but also other institutions to make it happen. So despite its clear importance. So the ethics of doing research and our obligations to participate is one thing I want to address, but I think that wasn't really discussed. The second is this idea of focusing on the ethics of prevention and preparedness. We talked a lot as ethicists during the pandemic and prior to that about the ethics of response. And so we talked a lot about vaccine distribution, about vaccine mandates and other kinds of mandates, the ethics of lockdowns and so on, and the distributions of other kinds of resources, access to ventilation and so on, ventilators and so on. But we haven't really talked as much about the ethics of preparedness and prevention. And that's partly because we've kind of got into this way of speaking, which suggests that better preparedness is the solution to those ethical problems. If only we thought ahead and got frameworks in place, then we wouldn't face those ethical issues in response. But I think that neglects the fact that preparedness itself presents a whole range of ethical questions. And I'm less skeptical about the idea of prevention. I mean, because I was clearly preventing zoonosis is not going to be possible, but the idea of early intervention, so very good surveillance, but early intervention strikes me as something that we could potentially be better at. But that raises a whole range of questions that I think are important ethical questions that are under. So, for example, we tend to talk about global surveillance. Well, the reality is that we're going to be looking at particular hotspots, which are primarily in lower middle income countries. We're going to be looking at behaviour of farmers on marginal land. Often they're going to be poor people in countries, Vietnam, Delta, etc., and other places. So what are the ethical issues of identifying an outbreak and suppressing it in those kinds of contexts in the global interest? What are our obligations to those countries and those people? So there's a range of questions there to do with collective action, where these interventions may not be in the interest of those governments, but also questions about what obligations we have to people in those situations. So lots more I could say there, but I guess what kind of catchphrase I'd like to leave you with on that one is, it strikes me that scientists are increasingly good at identifying the characteristics of a hotspot for emerging infections with pandemic prevention. I'd like us to think of scientific and ethical hotspots and sort of try to see them as related to each other. And then the third theme I wanted to introduce was this one about trust. It strikes me that yesterday and today we talked a lot about how can we increase trust in science, government, and so on. I think it'd be useful to think about trustworthiness. So what are the kind of requirements that might be important in thinking about what might it take to what are the requirements for well-founded trust and confidence in institutions? What might be the indices for trustworthiness as opposed to trust? I think that's kind of an interesting way of thinking about things. And that's going to be true of government, science, and institutions. So a bit of a flip into looking at the requirements for trustworthiness rather than trust. And then my final comment is related to those two last things, which is if we're really serious about pandemic prevention and preparedness, we're going to have to get into some sticky kind of ethical relationships, it seems to me, with countries that may not gather that data in ways that we would be happy with. So it's going to involve working closely with authoritarian governments, but also governments which have more collectivist, less individualist approaches. So how do we feel about data that's being received from countries that don't adhere to human rights standards and so on? Seems to me there's a strong argument for taking the data, but there are also, it's messy, it's ethically messy. There's no, I don't think, kind of purely ethical way forward from that. We're going to have to deal with some difficult compromises. So I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you very much, Mike. So I think two things are very important here. One is the issue of collective action and collective responsibility. And the other interesting thing is about the issue of having to coordinate action among governments or countries or populations that have different systems of values. So not every country has the same system of values that we would wish, but we need to have collective action with these countries, and that creates problems. So I think there is enough on the table for an interesting discussion, and I'm going to open the floor now. I would just throw on the table two extra considerations that haven't come up, but I think it might be worth considering. So one is the issue of cost-benefit analysis that has always been brought up during the pandemic, because one of the charges that was often raised against governments that many pandemic policies have been implemented without a proper cost-benefit analysis. For example, without considering whether the interventions, the measures were producing more or less damage than the disease itself. So this is an issue that often came up. And the other is, so talking about ethics, is the place of freedom in all this debate, because when we talk about introducing restrictions or any kind of measure, we introduce measures in a system of values that include values like freedom. So we always often talk about equity, about trust. These are very important values. Many people value freedom above all these other values. Many people value freedom above health. And you might disagree with this view, but the problem is that you have to implement policies taking into account that some people do have these different priorities. And there's a challenge there about how to take into account of all values and treating people fairly, considering people have different kinds of values. So I'm not going to say, I'm not going to talk about it. I just want to throw this there because I think it's an interesting, another interesting issue that some of you might be willing to discuss. Now, let's open the floor to questions. We have a bit more than 15 minutes. So unfortunately, people online will not be able to ask questions. So the discussion is only for people in the room. It's a kind of reward for people showing up in person, because most of you have to come uphill to this thing. So it is a reward that you get to ask questions, either to the speakers or to each other, or if the speakers have questions for each other, that would also be interesting. But I will give priority to people in the room if anyone has any question to any of the speakers or to all of us. So anyone has any question? Yes.
No, great. Thank you so much. That was such an amazing set of reflections and expertise. And it's not very well formulated, but I think, one of the interesting kind of themes coming out is about kind of constraints, kind of slowing things down. And one kind of experience that seemed, at least along the kind of medical research side, and maybe this is one of the successes, was how we sped things up. You know, what did we loosen in order to rapidly respond, to get governments, you know, to move, to have products move quickly, to have regulatory frameworks that were more amenable to that kind of acceleration. And I wondered, just in terms of thinking the legacy, or, you know, the long-term, you know, useful structures from a governance perspective that might have come out of COVID. What do you see about kind of where regulations are happening about medical research? Has it changed about how we think about, you know, R&D? You know, how are there kind of, yeah, just what is the legacy of that experience going forward?
So as a general rule, I will give Larry the first say on the question, because he's the superstar of the meeting. So, but then of course,
I'm far from it. First of all, I just wanted to say, you know, that Imogen, Mark, and Peter, Mike, I mean, I learned so much from you. I mean, really, just brilliant. I wish we had so much. This is kind of a lifetime discussion. I think you actually raise a new issue that we haven't seen before. I mean, it wasn't quite like the AIDS epidemic where we really changed our research regulation and ethics in terms of fast track research and the trade-offs between, you know, efficacy and safety and getting things quickly to the market. So it didn't happen quite that much, but we saw it in regulation, particularly the use of emergency use authorization or emergency listing in WHO parlance. So basically, we got things to the market way before we ordinarily would have. Couldn't have fully approved, you know, vaccines or Paxlovid or the monoclonal antibodies, a whole range of things. And the same thing we've seen with monkeypox. We've actually deployed things that we thought, you know, we saw that were effective against smallpox, but we assumed they were also effective against monkeypox. And I think also, you know, Peter made this point as well, you know, about how, you know, we should have been researching these issues because they've been ongoing in sub-Saharan Africa and other countries for a long time. We shouldn't really have been put in this position. Monkeypox is a great example of that. But yeah, so we do have to learn. And then, you know, one of the things I've been talking about with FDA and White House is, you know, what's going to happen when the emergency ends, and whether how we're going to continue to deploy these things. And the FDA commissioner said to me, and this is probably true in the UK and everywhere else, he says, we have more than 70 products that were out there that were under emergency regulation. And so we're right now rapidly trying to think through how we push those 70 things. So it's a lot. I mean, we could just, you know, we should just all get together and spend our life and write books and books and books. There's just so much we learn about this. And I love this, you know, we've got this science, history, you know, law, ethics. It's fantastic. It's really good.
great, thank you. Does any, yes, you have a point on this?
Slightly, but I have a question as well.
Okay, so yeah, so I'll put it down. Has anyone?
No, it's interesting. We've kind of shifted expectations. So, in response to monkeypox, the government put out a grant call to run a trial in monkeypox tecovirimat, which we applied for. When we got the award letter, it said you have to start recruitment within 14 days. And we were like, well, okay, well, we did that for recovery, but that was using something that was in the cupboard in the hospital. And now you want us to use an experimental drug, which is currently in the US, at home with a placebo, and you expect us to meet 14 days. They had no realization of actually what that meant. And then the sort of the operating framework's gone back again to the old ways. You know, so I think we've changed the expectations, but it's not yet filtered down to changing the operating framework, which we really need to do. We need to simplify trials. There were hardly any trials in low-income countries. It's not because there's not people there who can do research. It's because doing a regulatory standard trial is so complicated. You need an army. You don't have those.
Mike, you have a
Well, no, just a brief. I think that's a really important point. But just to add, I think there are one or two places where these which elements are at risk. So I think, for example, the use of health information in health data, potentially we could learn some really valuable things from that. But because of all these other issues that Mark and others talked about, trust and so on, there's a real danger that that goes the other way. And become much more wary of using information. Very beneficial. So I think some things are more obviously beneficial, but there are some that are kind of could go either way, and I'm a bit worried about that.
They could, and I think your point, Mike, two things that you'd said that really struck me is, one is how we did deploy so many interventions where we lacked evidence and we made no effort to find out whether they were true. And they're still true. Things like, travel restrictions, school closures. I've been on so many WHO and CDC and other calls, and nobody really knows whether they work, when, and what. And then the idea of gathering information. This is a particular problem in the United States. The CDC can't even require a state to give it the data. So we ended up forming most of our policy of, what works for vaccines, what doesn't work, which boosters not. We got that from Israel, we got that from the UK a little bit, and we got that from South Africa with Omicron, but we really, and then people are really not that they focus much more on their own individual privacy, and they don't think what obligations they have. It is a very minor burden for them. It goes back to trust, because they don't trust what the information will be used for, I think.
Thank you. So we have a question from Dominic and one from Imogen. Dominic?
Larry, thanks again for last night. I wanted to raise something that came out of a discussion that you were part of with some international co-authors talking about learning from the pandemic, and particularly failing to learn from the pandemic. And some of our Japanese co-authors reflected on the recurrent experience of natural disasters and earthquakes in Japan. And every time there's another big earthquake, everyone says, why didn't we learn the lessons? And there were three proposals of why we didn't learn. One is the distance between them is typically long enough that people have forgotten. So if we have another pandemic next year, we'll be kind of all primed. But if it's in 10 years, 20 years, or 30 years, memories are short. Secondly, when they come again, it's not that like they're exactly the same. They're not, the earthquakes are fairly kind of homogeneous, but each time the effects of them are slightly different. So each pandemic will be different in some relevant ways. So we can't just apply what worked this time. But then most importantly, and this is where the question comes in, it costs. It costs to prepare and to remain prepared for the next earthquake or for the next pandemic. And the biggest challenge that we have is these resources that are required come at the cost of something else. And we have some massive international, global priorities, challenges at the moment, both political and particularly environmental. And the question is, how do we weigh up pandemic response, climate, international political crises? How do we manage those, and how do we, both in terms of financial resources and of course attention, political attention and public attention?
I don't know the answer how we actually are able to do that. Kind of the flip easy answer, of course, is that if you prepare for them, it's really much more cost effective than if you think about the amount that countries around the world have expended in terms of emergency response and building up social safety nets at the time and then recovery. Look at the pound now. There is a, but that politicians tend not to. I think they've got a much shorter term horizon because they're looking to the next election, the current political, and then and then another flip answer is that for things like climate and food insecurity and their connection to mass migration or outbreaks, epidemics, pandemics, they actually cause many more lives than conflict, and yet we spend a lot of money on military and defense, very little on this. I mean, I say that's a flip answer because in society, people value, strong militaries, and so I mean, I don't know how to shift the dynamic other than to try to make the case in terms of ethics and values and lives saved. So I really don't know how you actually move that. And I agree with a lot of the people that were saying, lessons learned is an easy phrase. Whether that actually, where that gets us, it's very hard to know. But I think, one of the things I took home from the discussions was just the importance of science. One of the big, as I said last night, of all the failures we had, science was really, spectacular in this. It wasn't as spectacular as the public wanted it to be, particularly since it doesn't have very much impact against transmission risks. But in terms of, we wouldn't all be here now without masks, had it not been for, Oxford AstraZeneca messenger RNA technology that really got us where we are today. So we do have to see those benefits.
Thank you. Anyone has any? You, Peter, has raised your hand? No. Sorry. Okay, so Imogen.
So I wanted to ask a question, partly of Mark and also some of the scientists, as a lawyer. So having sort of inadvertently stolen some of Mark's thunder, but the reason was I was really fascinated listening to him talk about how you see laws, and you, as a lawyer, you think about how you might frame a law or how a law ought to be framed, and then watch it deployed and the implications of it and how its deployment doesn't really necessarily match what was intended. And then that was what was really interesting, is hearing that there was sort of on the fly moderation of the way it was deployed. And what I'm interested in hearing the scientists as well talk about the way clinical trials worked and so on is, what would you say are the legal responses that we'd hope for next time that would do a better job, right? So for Mark, the question is, what would have been better on the ground in terms of the people who are policing? What kinds of rules would have worked better? Because it seemed to me that either having quite vague rules, as we were discussing, was problematic, or having really stringent rules that people just weren't going to follow was problematic. Having vague guidelines was demonstrably problematic because people didn't know what to do, and some people followed and some people didn't. What should lawyers do next time, right? What should we be thinking about as a better way to do things? And similarly for clinical trials, it sounds like the old regulations mired things in too much time, but now so many controls have been let off. Is that too much, right? What's the recalibration on that one? But basically, what should law do to support the sorts of things that you're saying were problematic that we could do better? How could law help to make things better next time?
Yes, difficult question, particularly for a non-lawyer. I think that part of the issue with, as far as the police were concerned, is that how to balance sometimes the requirement to protect human health and welfare against other legal requirements, like right to protest and other things like that. And so in some ways it wasn't always an issue about, I think, about the clarity of the legislation. It was maybe more a problem of how to interpret it in relation to other legislation or other parts of the same legislation. And that was probably the issue. Now, I mean, if there's, so I mean, the thing that sort of came up time and time in when I was discussing this with police and also with lawyers was about how to to try and find a balance between those conflicting requirements and what that actually means in a specific operational context. So I really not. I mean, I'm not the right person to ask about whether there could have been something which would have been done to clarify the legislation more. But I don't think that was the main issue. I mean, there were certain aspects which are ambiguous. There are loopholes in the legislation. But my own feeling is about some of the loopholes that existed was that they were quite important as basically safety valves. And so thinking of it from particularly from say a public order perspective, I think that had those loopholes not existed, had people not sometimes been able to find workarounds and so on, and that also includes police, I would say, then then life would have been much more difficult than it really was, and we would have ended up with a much more dangerous public order situation, which would have impacted on the public health situation. So I think a little bit of ambiguity was not necessarily all bad.
Yeah, I mean that's what I was thinking. Partly is that if you have too many overt loopholes, then there's almost a desire, there's an openness to say, well, actually, you can circumvent as you wish. But having none and being too stringent is too far, because then the lid just blows off, and it's negotiable.
No, I think we sort of hit a kind of nice balance in the sense that a lot of people knew the loopholes were there, but no one was actually speaking out in public.
Thank you. So, Peter, you.
Yeah, I think, I'm obviously looking at it from a very sort of restricted angle of sort of regulation of research, pretty much. And I think one of the problems is kind of this federalization, Larry was talking about the states, where there's collective action, collective research that will have global benefits, but the risks lie in institutional, individual level. So when you've got a lawyer for an institution, they're just, all the risks lie with us, none of the benefits lie with us. Therefore, we have a 30-page contract, and when you're trying to do something quickly, it completely makes it impossible. The reason the recovery trial worked was because we set out a standard contract with a take it or leave it, and at the same time, the Department of Health said there are no other trials. So they kind of were boxed into they do nothing or they do recovery trial, whereas that wasn't the case in most countries, which meant that they didn't get their trial started quickly enough because they defaulted to having to have a legal agreement with every single institution legal team, which just took too long. So, and I think it's true of ethics as well. We had individual ethical approval of 3,000 trials. At a sort of meta-ethical level, that wasn't ethical because there was so much replication and so many of those trials were underpowered that although that individual trial might have ticked your ethical boxes, when you looked at it at a higher level, it wasn't. I think it's the same with law, that you've got the legal issues at institutional level, but at a higher level, it's not a global benefit. And I don't know how you put in place those structures to be able to sort of de-risk it ethically or legally, to be able to do these things that have global benefit.
It's really interesting. I think, and maybe Mark's point was the one that really captured this, is that I'm going to paraphrase you, but really pandemics kind of are a window, are a mirror of ourselves. They amplify what we already are. Because if you think about law and trust, and it turns out that in places that had the most stringent laws, did best and had highest trust, which is in East Asia. Basically, countries, a little bit of Vietnam, but Singapore, Taiwan, a little less so Japan, and China, of course, which is the most extreme of all. They're suffering the consequences now. And so I guess we maybe just didn't realize the extent to which the general public in the UK and the US and other places really did value freedom more than they valued collective action and security. And they just never did have trust in institutions, and this was just an amplification of it in a mirror. I don't know how to explain all the different ways that different countries behaved, other than that they have this basic culture of more of a collectivist society, believing in the common good, thinking that government is for their benefit, whereas in Western countries that may have not been so. Just all very perplexing about how you unravel it all.
Yeah, I just want to pick up on that point. So I think, I agree with a lot of what you're saying there, but also I think it's important not to kind of fall into sort of kind of cultural stereotypes, really, about particularly about Asian collectivism and things like
That's
that.
true,
right?
Course, yeah.
Which I'm not accusing you of doing, but I think it's sometimes I've seen these really simplistic explanations about why say Taiwan, South Korea, and so on, were doing better than some Western countries. Whereas, I mean, it's really important to bear in mind that even within those countries, a lot of the support is contingent. And so if you look at, say, South Korea, 2015, with the MERS outbreak, I mean, there wasn't much trust in the government there in that instance, right? But obviously things have been repaired since then.
And they,
Quite the specificities are quite important, I think.
but even with MERS, they were able to, they had that huge outbreak, and then they contained it fairly quickly. I was just reflecting on the fact that those countries had mechanisms, legal mechanisms that were coercive that we never had here. Things like the travel apps, very common, and in terms of closures and other kinds of intrusive surveillance that seem to, contact tracing, testing, all of that seemed to work better there than they did here. And I don't know why, because normally you'd think the more coercive you are, the less trust you're going to have. But it didn't. What I'm saying is it just seems more complex than that, not simpler.
Thank you. Well, unless the coercion works very, very well, so the trust doesn't matter. Anyway, so Mike has what he promised was a very short comment.
Yeah, just well, as a response to that, I think on your idea that the pandemic is a mirror to some extent of our societies. I mean, one thing I would say about law is, without being a lawyer, is that there are notable absences as well as laws that did or didn't work. So, for example, one of the things that I would have liked to have seen, whether legally or some other way, is better employment protection. So people who test positive know that they've got it, they self-isolate, they've got a job at the end of that. And there was some work done around rent. You couldn't evict people. There was some sort of, but somewhat similar kind of balancing of, so that laws actually make people feel more secure in social ways as well as in these kind of.
And the CDC's eviction prevention moratorium was struck down by the Supreme Court in the end. So.
Okay, thank you very much. So I think it's time to wrap up. So this has been extremely interesting. So let me just say, take 1 minute for some acknowledgement. So first of all, Professor Larry Gostin has been here to Astor visiting lectureship, which was awarded to Professor Erika Charters, who's a professor of the global history of medicine, and he's the organizer of all these events, also the mind behind all these events. We should thank Erika, first of all, for this event. And also we should acknowledge the contribution of the Wellcome Center for Ethics and Humanities, the Oxford Hero Center for Practical Ethics, where I'm based, Torch, so the Oxford Research Center in Humanities, the Pandemic Science Institute, of course, the Faculty of History, and so the Oxford Center for the History of Science, Medicine, and Technology, and the ATHOC Center as well. So all these centers contributed to these events, which are part of this new network, this network that Erika is now chairing, the Medical Humanities network in Oxford. And hopefully it will be the first of a series of successful events in the future years. So thank you very much to Professor Larry Gostin. It's really a pleasure to have such a prominent speaker here, and to the other panelists, Professor Mark Harrison, Mike Parker, Peter Horby, and Imogen Gould. And thanks everyone for being here. I think a round of applause is due to every one of us.